Hello and welcome to our World Built Environment Forum webinar series. Today we will be discussing investing in green buildings from the perspectives of finance options and premia. At the end of this webinar we will be revealing a discount code for our forthcoming World Built Environment Forum Summit, which is going to be taking place in New York in May, and you can find out more about that at the web address rics.org/WBEF. My name is John Krause and I am the Director of External Affairs at RICS. Now, according to the International Energy Authority, buildings account for 30% of energy consumption and 28% of CO2 emissions globally. In other words, they are central to meeting targets on reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And that means directing more investment into green buildings. We have three leading industry experts to talk about this with us today, and I'm going to ask each of them to invite themselves in turn. So firstly, William Bello from the International Finance Corporation. William.
Hi, thank you, and hello to all. My name is William Bello. I work for the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. We focus on developing economies. And I work within the Financial Institutions Group of the IFC, particularly focused on climate. So my role is to support financial institutions lend more to the green economy. And one of my particular focuses is green buildings and making sure that financial institutions provide the financing needed to develop the green building market. I'm based in Washington, D.C.
Thanks, William. Secondly, we have Tatiana Bostiels from Hermes Investment Management. Tatiana.
Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm working with Hermes Investment Management, where for the last 10 years we have really been pushing an ambitious program of responsible property investment, and we strongly believe that green buildings are a core element of delivering holistic returns to our clients. And I'm very interested to discuss with you where the industry is going forward, and looking in particular at how the industry can deliver sustainability outcomes that support the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you. And last but not least, Dr. Kath Jackson from the University of Sheffield in the UK.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm Kath. I teach aspiring surveyors, I suppose, on our master's courses here, accredited by the RICS, mainly teach them valuation and investment. And I've undertaken a couple of funded projects funded by the RICS on investor decision making. The first more generally, and then the second really focusing in on the sustainability agenda to see how things have changed over the last 10 years.
Thank you, all three. So a wealth of expertise at our disposal over the next hour or so. Now, as the audience, you can submit questions by the question box, which you should be able to find below the presentation on your screen. We'll try to pick some of those up as we go along and address others towards the end of the webinar. And at some point in this webinar, we'll also be asking the audience two questions in the form of an online poll to get your views direct to the panel to react to. So, without further ado, I'd like to start with a really fundamental question, and it's this: what do we mean when we talk about green buildings? William.
So, full disclosure, IFC has its own definition of what a green building is. We have a tool called EDGE, E-D-G-E, which you can find on the web. And this actually is our own certification of for green buildings. And we classify that as a building that is saving 20% of energy, embodied energy, and water in its construction and operations. So we at the IFC have our own particular definition. But we do also recognize other definitions. I think the bottom line for us, however, is that we need to be able to quantify what constitutes a green building. I think historically we've been a little lax in terms of coming up with what are the actual impacts of a green building, and that's something that we are pushing for. In fact, with the UK Department of BEIS, Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, we are working on making sure that that is how green building certifications become better defined going forward.
Thank you. So a very clear and firm definition that the IFC is working with. Tatiana or Kat, do you have a definition of how you would assess what is a green building?
Tatiana here with Hermes. We actually don't have such a clear definition of what a green building is, and what we are aiming to do really is to ensure that our responsible property investment strategy deliver sustainability outcomes through our responsible investment processes. And through that, in our view, green needs to go beyond just the environmental aspects, but also look at the economic and the social aspects. We are particularly focused on this element of social outcomes in the work that we are doing in our regeneration project as part of our meaningful placemaking processes. And so what I would have to say is, by this broad definition of green, what the industry means is ensuring that as an industry, the real estate investment industry or the property industry deliver sustainability outcomes through investment and management of buildings. We do have some minimum environmental requirements from our building. We build on green certification and covered biodiversity, materials, water, waste management, energy, climate. But the key really is to also look at social outcomes and economic outcomes as part of our overall green building strategy.
Okay, so and I think we'll possibly come back to this idea of outcomes later on. Kath, do you want to add something to that?
Just quickly, that I think that what William and Tatiana have said really encompasses what I've found is there's a danger that a green building doesn't mean the same thing to everyone, and that in itself can be a little bit dangerous if you're having a conversation but you're talking about different things. And the impression I get is that there is this move away from just environmental sustainability to bring in, excuse me, all the other ESG type aspects going right across the board, really, as Tatiana said. So whatever it is that it means, I think that whoever's having the conversation needs to be really clear to make sure that everyone is really talking about the same thing.
Yeah, so we'll come back to this, and it sounds like it's more than just the environment and the performance of the building. It's about its social impact. What does it do for its impact on people and the way they experience the built environment? I want to move to our next question, and we've got another slide coming up here. And I mean, the IFC has delivered over, I think, $265 billion of finance in developing countries. And so, from that experience, William, how would you say has been your learning? What has been your learning about the role of the private sector?
So yeah, I mean the IFC focuses on supporting the private sector in emerging markets, whereas the World Bank focuses more on the public sector. So I mean, obviously, you know, I'm a hammer and everything looks like a nail to me, but we do really believe that the private sector is absolutely fundamental to addressing our development challenges as we go forward. And there is nowhere is this more true than in climate change, where the sums that we are talking about are obviously huge, and there's no way that the public sector can deal with this. They can only really turn or nudge the rudder on the ship, so to speak. So when we look at green buildings in particular, the IFC has just completed our third review of climate investment opportunities. And this one focused on cities. And as the slide, I assume everybody can see this slide, says, we identified $24.7 trillion worth of green building opportunities over the next 11 years just in emerging market cities. And to put that into context, the cities research was broader. It looked at all of the opportunities that cities had to address climate change. The total number was just over 29 trillion. So a very large part of the city's investment agenda when it comes to climate is green buildings. Now, the amount that the private sector is going to have to provide of that, it's generally estimated to be over 70, around 80% of, and closer to 80% of the total amount has to come from the private sector. So you're looking at over, $20 trillion US over the next 11 years has to come from the private sector for us to be on track for the nationally determined contributions. So absolutely fundamental. And then, I mean, to a point that I think has been raised a couple of times earlier on around the definition of green. For us, if the private sector is going to engage, it can't just be green. Green by itself is not a reason for the private sector to come in. There has to be a business case behind it as well. And I think that's largely the role of the IFC, is to make sure that people do understand the business case for green buildings. And so when we look at this market, we see four main areas where we really do need to engage and provide support so that the relevant actors come in and play the roles that they need to. I've already mentioned the EDGE program. We think that providing a clear certification is an important facet for this market to develop. Obviously, there are other certifications out there. We believe the EDGE addresses certain aspects that aren't addressed by others. Most pertinently, this tool is not aimed at the higher end of the point of the property pyramid. It's aimed much more at the middle and lower end. And part of the reason we've been able to do that is by trying to provide some financial insights into the decisions that one can make around green buildings. So the EDGE tool actually helps you. You put in, for example, double glazing. And so you put in double glazing for your building parameters, and it will show you how much that will cost, but also how much you will save and what your payback period would be. So it gives people a line of sight onto the financial implications of the decisions they're making around a green building to get to those 20% thresholds that we were talking about. That per se is very useful, but it's not enough. We also know that, as I was saying earlier on, private sector investment is critical to make this happen. And so working with financial institutions to help them understand the business case is absolutely a critical part as well. And so as I mentioned earlier on, I work for the Financial Institutions Group of the IFC, and a lot of what we do is educating banks around what a green building looks like, how they can go and identify them, and to help them to develop pipelines and, in fact, products to address that. We also work more broadly with the building sector, again, leveraging the EDGE tool. Sorry, this isn't meant to be a pitch for the IFC, but really why we engage, why we think all of these aspects of the market are so important. So helping the building sector to understand that building a green building doesn't need an extra 10% upfront costs, for example. There are ways of doing this. In fact, we are beginning to get evidence that once you know how to build a green building, you can do this more quickly and more cheaply. And then obviously there's the working on regulations, which is key as well, and helping governments to start to incentivize the green buildings over other buildings.
You've got some details, I think, to show us of how that breaks down by sector and type of building.
Yeah, and I suppose this is just to try and add a little bit of color. The next two slides just add a little bit of color about what we have done to date. This has come up weirdly, but I don't know why those links haven't worked. They basically show, I mean, all that we can see here. I tell you what, I can actually go to my own version of this if we have time and show you. See if I can find it.
I can maybe explain that we've got financial intermediaries, $876 million, or 20% of the amount invested, mobilized. Hospitals, about 23% I think about $1 trillion. And then we have rather small amounts, relatively speaking, 5% for homes, 18% for hotels, 9% for mixed-use industrial, 19% for retail, so quite a big chunk there, and 6% for schools and universities. The breakdown.
So and that wasn't $1 trillion; that would be $1 billion. But I mean, the point there is that we see opportunities in virtually every sector. Obviously, the more usage you get, so if you look at hospitals and hotels and 24/7 building operations, obviously the paybacks tend to be a bit quicker. It's a slightly easier financial decision to make once one's aware of the implications. And this slide also just helps us to picture what we're talking about. And it shows you that virtually every type of building there is a green building opportunity there. And just one final point: residential at the moment is small, but actually we see that's a huge opportunity for us going forward. And a lot of our focus over the next few years will be focusing on trying to bring out the business case for green buildings in residential. I'll stop there.
Okay, so I think a really key aspect there is how the financial intermediaries contributing here, and you said the public sector can't make this change. They can do little more than nudge it with the sorts of figures they're able to mobilize. So how are the financial intermediaries going to go around building their portfolio of green buildings?
So I think there are a couple of points to make up front. One is that we've been working with financial intermediaries on broader green portfolios for a couple of decades now. And while we have worked with over 150 FIs in this space, we do an annual review with them, we do an annual survey with them, and we know that on average, green portfolios are still around the 5% mark. So they're still very low. What we also know is that buildings are a key part of most financial institutions' portfolios. And so there is an opportunity to, they understand buildings, but they may not understand green buildings. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to help them better understand that. At the moment, those banks that do have active portfolios of green assets, around 22% of them do have a footprint in the green building space. What we have learnt with the FIs is that they have nothing against green buildings. They just don't necessarily understand them or have an experience of them. So we found that coming in and helping them to identify where the green building opportunities already are, where the investments are already planned within, say, India or Brazil or wherever it is a very helpful way to get them better involved in this. And then also helping them to understand how they can differentiate themselves by developing specific financial instruments aimed at green buildings. And actually, something like the Edge tool itself, or something like the Edge tool, helping them to get a line of sight on those financial implications I was talking about is a great opportunity. And we know that 80% of energy efficiency opportunities within buildings that make financial sense now still do not get invested in. And the only plausible reason for that is because people don't understand that yet.
Yeah, so financial models important. You're hinting there at green bonds, green mortgages, home improvement loans, those sorts of things. And the question now, I think, is really, what are the lessons we're learning? I think one lesson you're saying there is that intermediaries don't understand enough about the possibilities. They perhaps don't appreciate the risk profiles and so on. And even when there's a strong business case, they seem still reluctant to make a move. I wonder, are there any other lessons? And I think perhaps I'll ask Tatiana and Kath at this stage. From all that you've heard, what lessons do you think we can draw so far from the IFC's experience?
Sorry, shall I go first? It's Kath here. Everything that William has said, it's just kind of how it all sounds reasonably straightforward, but in the research that I was involved with, there was real difficulty in identifying a payback period, which is key, really. If you're going to spend some money, you need that payback period, and it just wasn't straightforward to calculate it. There was no quantifiable impact, or at least not one that's clear enough to be able to identify a payback period with sufficient confidence. And so the sort of behind what William said, that's the thing that I would comment on, that it's not always straightforward to do that.
Yeah, so very much what investors have in mind is, how long is it going to take me to get my money back? What's the rate of return? Tatiana, you're making investments. Does that sound familiar to you?
To be fair, no. No, we have moved a long time ago from looking at the payback from green per se. What we are looking at is our holistic returns outcomes, which look at what rent can we expect from a building in a given location at a given time in the market cycle, what capital appreciation can we expect if we refurbish a building according to certain specifications which reflect the demand of that particular location at that particular time. And so the returns we are looking at are real estate investment returns, that is rent, yield, capital appreciation. We're not looking at specific paybacks from the green aspect of a building per se. And we've been able to prove and to demonstrate that our expert opinion that delivering highly specified green building in certain locations for certain at certain times in the building cycle is actually delivering and hence long-term financial returns to our asset owners. And this is very much what we are building on. Going back to the point about what we have learned from the IFC, and a lot of credit to the Multilateral Development Bank and organization, and in particular to the IFC, I think that the strategy that Will has presented on the building market transformation is crucial, is that in order to ensure that as private sector actors we can contribute our role in the transformation of a sustainable, climate-aligned, circular economy, it's about developing an ecosystem of actors within the real estate industry that can deliver, each one on their own right, what will be required to the massive, as we said, shifting of the billions, and in fact shifting of the trillions. If we look at Will's number in terms of the investment opportunities in green building of 24.7 trillion in the next 12 years, which is about the time we have to address climate change. And so his building market transformation program is key, is about ensuring that the public and the private sector work together so that there is a support to scaling up investment in green building through some kind of firstly staking by multilateral organization. It's about putting their money where their mouth is, both themselves and us as private sectors, but it's also about having the right enabling environment and supporting the government policies. Green building codes and incentives are going to be really important, and we've seen some really good progress, especially in Europe, with the European directives on building performance, with the energy efficiency directive, and in a number of member states, such as France, for example, with energy transformation, Article 173 legislation, for example. So I think it's about developing an ecosystem and building on the good work that has been done to speed up this shifting of the billions. Because while we've been quite good at doing the initial step, we are nowhere near the scale of the challenge that we need to address to deliver both the climate agenda as well as the sustainable development goals through green buildings in the sustainable perspective.
Yeah, so the figures there you mentioned, the challenge of moving that capital is enormous, and I'm sure we'll get lots of questions on that. At this stage, I'd just like to move the debate on a little bit to the ESG considerations. So my question would be, what's the importance of integrating environmental, social and governance risks into investment decisions? And I think, Tatiana, that's one for you to answer.
First, there's been some very clear reasons as to why it's important to integrate green, sustainable buildings in our investment strategies. The first, as I've mentioned, and I will repeat it again, is the business case. We have been able to demonstrate that to deliver long-term risk-adjusted return, financial returns, you do need to integrate sustainability and the green aspect of building into your investment case. The second, which is just as important, is that we are working for long-term clients, asset owners, which tend to be pension funds, insurance companies, and of course the underlying beneficiaries, pensioners. And we have seen over the years that our ability to demonstrate that we integrate sustainability across our investment process has been a crucial aspect to both retaining long-term relationship with those asset owners and securing new clients. So it is for our own sustainability that we need to be able to demonstrate that we are actively and effectively managing sustainability. There is no pension fund today that doesn't have a question as part of its fiduciary duty in terms of what risk am I facing from climate change and how am I managing those risks for my beneficiaries. The same goes with insurance companies. They need to be able to stand up to their fiduciary duties and answer how they are managing climate risk, how they are contributing to limit physical impacts of climate change, for example. And that then translates to them asking us, what are you doing with the monies that you are managing on our behalf? And the final point has been about tenants. Key aspect of the real estate investment industry is occupiers, tenants, and we see now a growing demand not just for the green aspect of buildings, but even further in terms of health and well-being. How healthy it is for the employees of those tenants to work in the buildings that we manage on their behalf. So all of those three aspects are crucial in our view as to why we don't really have much of a choice. If anything, we need to go beyond where the market is today to be able to maintain our competitive advantage aligned to those 3 points.
And so it's very clear pointers there, and particularly, what do the clients want, what they're looking for, what's the impact on tenants, the demand that they're creating in the market. If we lift that up to the kind of the global macro level, how is this supporting the sustainable development goals? That's a question for Tatiana.
We've seen some numbers already by Will, but fundamentally, buildings, because of their nature, they are ubiquitous to people's life. More than now 50% of the population lives in cities. In OECD countries, we're speaking about 90% of people living in cities. The IEA has shown that when it comes to cost-effective measures to deliver the Paris Climate Agreement, about 30 to 40% of those are about improving buildings in terms of energy efficiency and green construction. So fundamentally, there is the role of real estate in delivering the UN Sustainable Development Goals is fundamental because of the very nature of real estate in our economy. We are at the moment looking in Hermes at how we can deliver sustainable outcomes, and we've identified 3 key impact activities where we are active that can support the Sustainable Development Goals. The first one is meaningful placemaking, which is about delivering cities which actually deliver not only sustainability in the sense of climate resilience or climate mitigation, but also it's about delivering a just climate transition in terms of ensuring that there are jobs to support economic development in those cities, that there are educational facilities to support the sustainable development goals when it comes to training skills and ensuring that the future generation are properly educated to respond to the challenges. we have identified health and well-being as a crucial aspect as one of the sustainable development goals, or a number of those sustainable development goals where we feel we can have a great impact. As I said, the majority of our time as urban dwellers is spent in buildings, whether it's our home, our offices, our schools. So there's a lot that can be delivered from real estate there. And the final one, again, is about a just climate transition and a circular economy transition. The amount of resources that is being used by the real estate industry is significant when you look at real estate development as well as refurbishment, but also in terms of the occupation of buildings. In OECD, again, 40% of greenhouse gas emissions happen within buildings, which is a very large number. If we want to achieve a reduction by 2050 of 80% greenhouse gases emissions to be aligned with the Paris Climate Agreement. So real estate is going to have to not only shift those trillions, but embrace new technologies and new ways of working to deliver what will be a considerable change in the way that we build, manage, and run buildings. But fundamentally, I believe that the technology and the know-how is there to do this.
So that's really good, and we can see that, you're mentioning placemaking and well-being, and I noticed one of our attendees, Robert Chapman, has exactly asked that question, what about health and well-being? So thank you for picking up that point for our attendees. I'd like to move on to the next question, because I think this is then, again, you mentioned, Tatiana, there, fiduciary duties, and if one looks at the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, they're encouraging companies to provide transparent information to investors and lenders and insurers on their climate-related financial risks. So, how do you go about aligning an investment strategy with the approach taken by the TCFD?
Yes, and first, for everyone in the audience, TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, are the awful acronym for what has been a spectacular driver in the investment industry to the uptake of analyzing and assessing climate risk and opportunities. Fundamentally, Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, when 6 years ago he stated for the first time that climate represented a risk to financial stability, has really triggered tsunami, playing with words. What we see today is we have the G20 Financial Stability Board and the central banks of the G20 countries more or less all stating that climate represents a risk to financial stability. We have in the UK the FCA stating that in time we are going to have to respond to the recommendation of this TCFD group. The Principles for Responsible Investment just yesterday announced that every member by 2020 will have to report in alignment with the recommendations. How do you do it? To be fair, the recommendations are wise. They don't ask you to do everything overnight. They ask you to consider your processes and to consider your investment strategies. And first look at the governance. Who has oversight for assessing and managing and mitigating those risks? And ideally, it has to be a board oversight. So you set up responsibilities with the leadership. They ask you then to look at your strategies. Do you have an understanding of what are the risks and opportunities that are ahead of us along a series of risks which are liabilities? Are you going to be liable under your fiduciary duty, for example, for not assessing those risks or addressing those in time? Transition risk, is there going to be any legislative differences? In the UK, with the minimum energy efficiency standards being introduced last year, we have seen now what is overnight, well, it took 5 years to implement, but we have seen stranded assets in terms of F&G rated assets that need to be refurbished before they can be sold in the market. And very importantly for real estate, there are the physical risk. How are we going to address the growing risk of extreme weather events? And more to the point, how is it going to impact our insurance premiums over time in relation to real assets and real estate assets? And finally, what they ask you to do is to spell out your risk management. So you've identified your risk, you identify your opportunities. What are you doing to address and to manage those risks? And it doesn't stop there. They also ask you to measure. So what are the metrics that you can use to measure those risks and those opportunities, whether it is greenhouse gas emissions in relative terms to your square meters or in absolute terms, or whether it is your exposure to certain physical impacts, such as flooding in the UK, for example. And in time, they ask you to set yourself targets. One way of doing that could be to set yourself targets, align or certify under the science-based targets, which just recently announced that they are now looking at how you can be aligned to a 1.5 degree scenario, which is in alignment with the Paris Climate Agreement and responds to the IPCC in their latest report, calling for the need to stick to that target or face serious consequences when it comes to physical impact. So it's a process which it's first progressive. It's about understanding risk and being in compliance with investors' fiduciary duty. And you can take the time to get to the more difficult part in terms of scenarios or metrics by first having a clear understanding of where your liability, your transition, and your physical risk lie.
It sounds like a very sort of comprehensive tool there, and one that people should go and take a very close look at, and it's only something that's going to be in greater demand in the future. I'd like to move us on. We're going to put a poll now to our audience, and so you will be seeing on your screen a question coming up, and you'll be asked to say the extent to which you agree or disagree with the following statement. And the statement is that for investors, green buildings command a premium. So do you agree with that or disagree with that? And you can use the online poll. And if you do that quickly, we will ask the speakers to respond to that. And I'll also just remind people that you do have the option of submitting questions online as well, and we will pick those up as we go along. So the poll is about to give the result, and what we see is that we've got 24% near enough strongly agreeing that there's a premium, and 53% agreeing, and only around 6% disagreeing. So the overwhelming majority here says there is a green premium. What do our panel make of that? So, Kath, I'd like to ask you that, please.
Yeah, absolutely fascinated to hear that result. I suppose my view is a bit different to some others in that I'm definitely one step removed. So I'm taking a bit more of a helicopter view of evidence that's out there. So in terms of published research studies, the literature definitely agrees with the results of our poll. In terms of speaking to fund managers, asset managers, sustainability team leaders here in the UK, it was 2 years ago, as a caveat, they pretty much fundamentally disagreed and said that there was not, green buildings do not command a premium, which was it was in stark contrast to other published research, and obviously in stark contrast to today's poll. So we sort of dug around a bit to see why they might think that. A few things came out. Fund managers reported that their valuers are not seeing market evidence of sustainability contributing to higher values. That came over really clearly from everyone that we spoke to. Just to pick up on one of Tatiana's points, talking about, I forgot what she said. Sorry, Tatiana. That it is that she is able to prove enhanced long-term financial returns from green buildings. Perhaps there's been a shift in the last 2 years. I don't know. Also, we found some of their messages, actually, the people that we spoke to, were a bit mixed. They spoke a lot about protecting asset values, of course. They spoke a lot about future-proofing, of course. and they started to say things that those aspects, if there's capex on sustainability enhancements with a mind to future proofing, then that would perhaps be reflected in a slightly lower yield. So there is maybe a little bit of an unclear message coming across there. But one thing which really does relate to some of the things that have been discussed is that all the respondents, without exception, so there was 13 people in the focus groups, so they've got experience across a huge range of funds, a number of funds each, and 8 other fund managers, is that it's hard or impossible to separate out the impact of sustainability features from the general spec of the building. Generally, if a building's newer, it's a higher spec, and the sustainability features and characteristics are higher. And they just found it impossible to absolutely identify that it was sustainability that was making a difference. And so the answer that we got through very strongly 2 years ago was that no, green buildings don't command a premium.
It's a very difficult question to ask and to try and answer. William, what's your response to this idea that buildings do create a green premium, but it would seem that those people operating in the market and making the investments don't really seem to see that?
Well, and as you said up front, what is green, and even that definition is unclear. But I mean, we are seeing that there is definite value to green buildings. Whether that feeds through to a higher price I don't think is definitive. But we do know there are some places where, particularly in the more developed markets, where green buildings do appear to be priced at a premium in specific situations. We also know that in some places there are quicker sales. There seems to be quicker sales when a building is green versus non-green. We also know that in the US there is a lower default rate, around 33% lower defaults for green buildings. Fannie Mae now offers lower interest rates and higher LTVs, loan to value, on green mortgages. In the UK, higher resale value is pitched at around 10 to 14%. I mean, I'm not contradicting Kathy, but there are these points of evidence where there does appear to be some value to a green building. And then we also see lower utility bills, and that's particularly important when we're looking at lower income households, where up to 20% of people's disposable income is spent on utility costs. So I think that there are touch points. There are points of evidence where we see that green buildings do provide value. It's not clear that that always comes through to the price of the building itself. And when we look at developing markets, that's an even murkier story, where actually we think that an awful lot of energy needs to be spent on trying to get that data and sharing it. And once it becomes a little bit clearer, assuming that there is a good story behind it, then I think we're going to see a big pickup in green buildings over traditional buildings.
Thank you very much indeed. So we're going to move on to the two kind of almost very different. I can't resist to just put one point there, if you wouldn't mind, Tatiana, here. So first, I actually agree, strangely enough, with both with Cass and Will. Fundamentally, we agree it is impossible to extract what is sustainability, which is contributing how many percentage points to the value. However, what we are seeing in the market is that the expert view, most of the investment models in real estate are based on discounted cash flow models, which are looking at fundamentally 4 key parameters to assess the investment value of a building. That is, what rent can you expect
what yield are you expecting to get in terms of capital appreciation? What is your expenditure in terms of capital expenditure for refurbishment and renovation? And what is the depreciation of your buildings? And fundamentally, if you ask any expert in the UK today, driven by regulation, driven by tenants' demand, what is a highly specified building today? They will tell you a number of features which you and I would agree are green. They will say they want a high BREEAM rating, they want a high energy performance certificate rating, they ideally want some biodiversity and sustainability features that lead to better health into the building. So while you cannot separate what is the percentage points that contribute to value, what we are seeing now is not so much a debate about is it a green premium, is it a brown discount, is that in certain parts of the real estate industry, and especially in central business district, in commercial real estate, or in those residential markets where there is not so much pressure on housing, which you see a lot across member states in the EU, maybe a little bit less so in the UK and let's say central London. What we are seeing is that expert view are clear that the high specification that you need to develop for a building to command high rents and to deliver capital appreciation include sustainability features. And that is really why in Hermes we stand up, and our opinion is to say that we are very confident that the financial return that we have been able to deliver to our asset owners over the last 3, 5, 7, 10 years in comparison to the benchmark and in absolute terms, which incorporates all of our sustainability improvements, are adamant that overall, looking at the market cycle, looking at the location of the assets that we invest in, looking at the specification in terms of sustainability that we have developed over time, all of these elements have contributed to that performance, and sustainability is one of them. We don't know by how much percentage.
Okay, so you're certainly putting your money where your beliefs are, as it were. We've put another poll question up here while we've been looking at that last one, and it's actually touching on the sorts of points that have just been made by our panelists. What extent do you agree that financial sustainability objectives are compatible for investors? So do investors find these financial objectives and the sustainability objectives compatible? What do our audience think? Let's have your answers and we'll have a look at the results. So we're getting 33% strongly agree and 33% agree. So 2/3 are agreeing or strongly agreeing, and around about 17% disagree, with the rest neutral. So a few more disagreeing, I think, on this one than on the last one. Still a very clear majority feeling that financial and sustainability objectives do or should align for investors. Kath, how does that strike you?
I would say exactly the same as last time. I'm surprised by that poll. That was different to what we found, but of course it is very encouraging and it's fantastic. I suppose the people that we spoke to, the fund managers, asset managers, the sustainability team leaders, the experts in their particular companies, they found that because as I said before, that they said there was no green premium. So if there was no financial benefit in terms of the enhanced value, whether that's rent or capital value coming from sustainability features, then that of course makes it really very hard to justify capex on those features. Again, digging around, they described how some improvements will come about naturally, generally replacing plants, over the course of time, generally replacing windows over the course of time. So things do happen. But doing things more quickly at higher levels was sometimes, not always, but sometimes seen as really very hard to do because it simply doesn't stack up. There is, and it came down to the fiduciary duty to clients. But picking up on what Tatiana said again, That does vary across funds. So we spoke to people individuals who manage a whole range of different types of fund, and it very much varies on the type of fund. So a charities fund, for example, is absolutely essential.
I think, Kath, we've put a slide up there which I think is talking to this point about the desirable property characteristics. So maybe this slide will help illustrate some of those points.
Yes, sort of. In the blue column, call it on average 10 years ago, you can see down at the bottom the BREEAM rating was pretty much ignored. It really wasn't important in the investment decision making. Up at the top, location was the absolute most important factor when looking to buy property, followed by obsolescence and so on. 10 years later, the BREEAM rating in the purple column has jumped up to third most important, still behind location. Tenant credit worthiness, perhaps unsurprisingly, has become more important. But within that BREEAM rating, there's kind of where I was going before. So charities, for example, they do have the freedom to take a more holistic view, as Tatiana said, and be seen to do the right thing. That is part of their duty to their clients, but not for all funds. So it really depends who the fund is, how much freedom they have. Also, Tatiana again talked about increasing demand from tenants for that type of property, which absolutely drives fund manager behaviour, one of the important factors that drives fund manager behaviour. But again, not across the board. It depends on geography. It depends on the size of the property and the size of the fund. What sector? Is it industrial? Is it retail? Is it office? And what sector the business itself is in. Earlier, Will used the phrase murky, so I'd just like to borrow that one. The picture outside of the prime regions and prime in all of those ways is very, very murky.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks. We've got a few minutes left, and I just really would like to try and address some of the questions that people have been feeding into us. And one here from Mark Drain, Urban Habitats Director, who's asking, I think really towards Kath, whether there's a difficulty in demonstrating cause and effect, and whether this, well, that's a clear point we've noticed, but whether it's simply down to the challenge in the research methods rather than the evidence or the absence of evidence. And there's another question that I want to pick up on, which is around, if we want to change investor behaviour, what is really going to change that investor behaviour? We've heard that there's tenant demand is a key thing, but what else is going to really shift investor decisions? So who wants to come back on those two questions?
I'll have a first crack. I think there are two. The way we look at it, there are two main areas. There are two main aspects that are going to change investor behaviour. One is data. So getting more data out. And again, I suppose I'm specifically focusing on developing markets where there is less access to the data, but helping people understand the financial implications of the decisions they make around green buildings, I think, is going to be key. Certainly something that we are going to focus on over the next 5 years or so. The other area is keeping an eye on regulation, and I think this is true for both developed and developing markets, and we've seen this with banks as well. Once it is clear that regulators are moving in a certain direction, that has a bigger impact on pricing of assets. So I think those are two areas that we need to keep in mind when we think about that.
Tatiana.
Oh, sorry.
Kath, please go.
Just really responding to Mark Drain's question. I think you're absolutely spot on. You said, is the difficulty in demonstrating cause and effect down to different research methods? I think so. I'm not saying one is better than the other, absolutely not. Some of the published studies use highly technical, quantitative statistical analysis using all sorts of fancy data and fancy techniques. The people that we spoke to use many years of market expertise, which of course that's different methods of using different data, analysing data differently. So I think you are probably absolutely right. But then if those operating in the market do not see green premia, some of them, obviously not everyone from what's been said today, yeah, how do we change that? And the answer might be down to the accessibility of data, which hopefully will improve over time.
So I'm going to give the last word on this question then to Tatiana before we wrap up. Tatiana, over to you.
2 points for me in terms of health and well-being, just to illustrate a point of value. If you were to ask anybody today, is there value in health and well-being, they probably will say, there's no way we can demonstrate that to you. However, if you just look at the drivers of real estate, what do we want? We have to have long-term relationship with our tenants, strong covenants. So clearly, as the issue of air quality is growing in cities, health and well-being is growing among concern by building occupiers, whether it's residential or commercial. And so in time, it will appear. There's always quite a big time lag. And also real estate data, it's very noisy. We are looking at investment cycles, which means that you have depreciation or capital appreciation, which are significant, driven by market changes which have very little to do with the specific characteristic of the asset and much more to do with the economic of the country or a particular aspect of the investment cycle. So the point here is to say, as an investor, and I take the point of Cass about depending on geography, location, sector, as an investor, what you're going to have to do is to look at all of the key drivers of real estate development, real estate investment, and also at your fiduciary duty in terms of an investor to account for long-term risk. And if you take those into account, I'm quite strongly of the view that there are a growing number of experts whose views is that they can see an impact of sustainability into those key real estate drivers when it comes to the investment process, as I've mentioned. So while it might not be reflected in valuation just now, or it might not be possible to extract the sustainability features of the valuation, the expert view is there, and we are seeing more and more an inclusion of sustainability criteria and health and well-being in highly specified buildings, whether it is residential or whether it is commercial. I fully agree, industrial is a different section. So it's about integration.
Wonderful, thank you. It's about integration. That is a very optimistic note to end on. That's all we've got time for today. So I want to say many thanks again to our three experts: William B. Lowe from the International Finance Corporation, Tatiana Bostiels from Hermes Investment Management, and Dr. Kath Jackson from the University of Sheffield. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. The discount code for our forthcoming World Built Environment Forum Summit is on the screen. You can see it there. It is WBEF webinar with the first 5 letters in capitals. Do please let us know what you thought of this webinar by completing the online questionnaire. And do please also take a look at what we're producing on the World Built Environment Forum website at rics.org/WBEF, where you can also find details of our upcoming webinars. And indeed, the next webinar in this series is going to be about algorithms and artificial intelligence and their impact on professions and skills. That's on the 20th of March at 4 p.m. GMT. So please do join us then. Thank you to everyone, and goodbye for today. Thank you.